Good morning, good afternoon, and indeed good evening, everybody, depending upon your respective time zones. I'm Andy Churley. I'm the head of marketing for BrandShelter, and I will be hosting this webinar today. And my special guest today is Haydn Simpson, who will be presenting. Just before we start, if we can run through a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat window, and at the end of the presentation, Haydn will respond to them if we have time. And secondly, after the presentation, we will be sending a link to all participants so that you can actually view the presentation again, or indeed forward that on to your friends and colleagues. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Haydn. I've had the pleasure of working with Haydn for over 12 years now, even though neither of us look that old. Haydn oversees brand protection services at BrandShelter, and previously he was at NetNames and GoDaddy. Haydn has over 20 years experience in domain names, online brand protection, and digital enablement, specialising in meeting the challenge that affect brands and delivering products and services through digital channels. Without further ado, now I will ask Haydn to start the presentation and take it from there.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everyone. So welcome to this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the global pandemic and how that has changed online brand protection. These are two very, very broad areas, and seeing that we have about the next 30 minutes to talk about a few aspects of it, obviously I'm not going to be covering everything, but I thought it would be useful to provide you with some thoughts as to how we see the discussions that we're having with our clients and our prospects, and also internally what we're looking at in terms of how we meet the challenges and opportunities for those clients and prospects in the future. In terms of a very rough agenda, we're going to look at the landscape and how that's changed over the last few months. We've got to understand that this is an evolving environment and it will continue to change now and in the future. But there are some central themes to this and there are some central challenges. So I'll talk a little bit about specific challenges and mitigation tactics that you can put in place, excuse me, for those challenges. So without further ado, we'll dive in. I think one of the things I feel really strongly about is defining to our clients what brand protection actually is. So if you ask 100 people what online brand protection entails, you'll probably get 100 different answers. So I thought it'd be useful just to put down what I think brand protection entails, where it starts and where it ends, and a little bit of the detail in between. The traditional view, if I can call it that, of online brand protection is that it's all about some monitoring, prioritization of data, and some enforcement actions, and that's valid. It's very valid indeed, and it's an integral part of that. But I think brand protection starts much earlier in the brand's life cycle, and I think it starts with the actual registration of IP rights themselves. So those registrations of trademarks, patents, design rights, etc., are really the lifeblood of a brand, and those registrations are designed to reflect current and future business needs at both the brand and the product level, and geographical indications as well. Off the back of those IP rights registrations comes the registration of what I will term digital assets, of which domain names and social media usernames and accounts are a couple of examples, with domains being the most important. Those registrations provide coverage and support for the registered IP rights, and they should reflect that trademark portfolio quite closely. Again, this is something that we work hard with our clients to attain, to understand what IP rights they have and how their digital assets should reflect that. And in terms of how that relates to brand protection, I very much believe that you should have the right digital assets in place to help you to protect your brands online. That isn't to say that you should be registering thousands and thousands of domain names that are defensive in nature and that you maybe don't need, but it's about being tactical in terms of how you put that strategic approach in place. So the registration is important, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Securing and optimizing those digital assets is an integral part of brand protection as well. It's very easy to register a domain name, and it's very easy to use it, to point it to the right content, to use it for email, etc. But it's also easy for criminals to take advantage of that. And there are some very straightforward and cost-effective ways that you can look to secure those digital assets at a technical level. And also you can make sure that those assets are working hard for your business by pointing them to the right kind of content and making sure that if you're using them for email, for example, they have some security for that in place as well. So that's an important step. The fourth step, I believe, is understanding third-party use of your IP rights. That's more traditional online brand protection, if you like. That could be discovery and monitoring of domain names, of social media channels, marketplaces, and e-commerce websites, for example. And I think a thorough understanding and knowledge of that threat landscape allows the correct type of brand protection to be put in place. It also helps you to control costs and to manage expectations in terms of what the outcome of those programs should be from a return on investment perspective. And indeed, obviously, the last piece is really enforcing the IP rights, so getting rid of any infringements that are key to the impact on your business, understanding what mechanisms there are in place for that, and being able to do that quickly and cost effectively is an integral part of online brand protection. So I think it's useful just to set those out in that detail. Really what we're looking at is an end-to-end approach, and that every stage of this kind of philosophy, if you like, should be part of the same strategy. And I think that'll allow you to get the best out of any online brand protection program that you put in place, and also any domain name registration program, in addition to managing your trademarks, etc., in the right way. So with that scene set, let's move forward. I find this a really interesting statistical slide. So this is a view of how many UK companies launched e-commerce sites or joined online marketplaces between February and June 2020, so from the start of the pandemic to a couple of months ago. I find these numbers really evocative of what's going on online. You can see, for example, fashion and apparel. We know that there's a good online market for that industry. We know that they're pretty active online, and we know that they've had challenges from having physical retail outlets shut. But to have 8,500 of those in 4 months in one country join e-commerce sites or online marketplaces, I think is staggering in terms of a number. I think that points to the exodus of retail from offline to online. And I think as we look at some of the challenges that causes, if you like, and some of the ways the criminals are reacting to that, it's important to understand the sheer scale of the numbers as to what's going on. What I also find interesting as well is that it's not just about your fashion and luxury. It's not about consumer goods. It's also about there's an industry category on here called agriculture, fisheries, and industrial food, where 3,500 companies have elected to start e-commerce in that period as well. Now, you wouldn't necessarily equate online distribution channels to that kind of industry, but I think it shows, the depth of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has affected every single industry, that you're getting such numbers of companies looking to trade and distribute their products and services online. So I think it's really interesting to look at it in this way, and it shows you the kind of scale as to what's shifting into the online and the e-commerce channel. So a couple of statistics here that illustrate that in a little bit more detail. So Raconteur is a supplement to one of the key daily newspapers in the UK. And they published a figure that following a survey that they did, that 97% of business decision makers say that COVID-19 has sped up their digital transformation. No massive surprise there, but almost half of them saying that it's sped it up by 5 to 14 years, which again I think is quite incredible. Off the back of that, obviously we have a budget increase as well. Almost 8 out of 10 people saying that their budgets have increased. With their key goals being to help, obviously, reach their growth goals, identify new business opportunities, and indeed keep and get more of the same customers that they had before COVID-19 struck. Again, I think those are quite evocative in terms of numbers. Shows you again, the scale. Doing business online now is far more important than ever. It was obviously pretty important before COVID-19 came along, but now I think there's a real focus for companies to diversify and to survive, and some of them are thriving as well through digital channels. Online has become the most important way to distribute products and services. Brand owners know that, but also criminals know that as well. So where there's opportunity for brands, there's also opportunities for criminals, and the kind of numbers that we've seen from the exodus of brands online, we also see from criminal activity as well, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. In terms of the consumers themselves, behaviour has changed dramatically. Lockdown affected vast tracts of the world and still does, and I think we'll see that go on and off over the coming months. So this is something that's here to stay. Some examples of that: card payments have risen 75% versus cash. That's a lot of that is done through online trading, electronic trading. Retail footfall is down 31% year on year. Obviously, that drives people through digital channels. Interestingly, I know I've got 2 teenage children, so this statistic is illustrative of that 27% of UK back to school spend has been on cleaning and sanitizing products. I'm not sure that we've spent 27% as a family, but again, I think we would have spent pretty much 0% last year. So again, that shows a shift, and 90% of that is done online. And looking forwards to what's coming up in terms of the November kind of shopping activity through Black Friday and Cyber Monday, leading into the retail, the normal retail increase before Christmas and New Year. Analysts are predicting that that's going to be up by 60% compared to last year. And I think that's conservative, to be honest. What's also interesting from a consumer perspective is that I'd love to say hands up how many people ever bought hand sanitizer online for the last few months. I'm betting it's a reasonably small percentage of the people in the audience today, but again, that's something that is being bought on a regular basis, and we've seen shortages of that over the last few months. Same with PPE equipment. Face masks obviously are now mandatory in a lot of places, so those are being sourced online. And also things like gym equipment, where people would be going to a gym, communal gym before, now have been setting up gyms in their homes. And there's a big demand for that kind of product. So what we're seeing is consumers not only moving online in terms of their buying habits, their spending habits, but also sourcing different types of products, which provides opportunities for some people to take advantage of that situation. Okay. In terms of the new landscape, we are also seeing increased attacks as well. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but the figure I'd like to draw your attention to is in the top left, where we've seen 1.1 billion individual attacks in the first 6 months of this year. And those are the ones that have been detected and stopped, which equates to about a 100% rise in attacks year on year from last year. So not only are the consumers moving online, not only are the brands moving online to sell to those consumers and also to other businesses as well, but the online criminals, the criminals are moving online in order to take advantage of that exodus, and we're seeing that kind of trend play out across industries and across geographies as well. So this is a global challenge. Talk about opportunities for the criminals. What's interesting to me is that I've been in online brand protection specifically since 2006 and domains since 2000. It's always really interesting to see when the press covers particular stories to do with online fraud and online counterfeit. And for some of you that I've known for a while, you'll know that I've been quite vocal about counterfeit, specifically over the last 10 years or so, because I believe it's not just a threat to brands and businesses, it's also a threat to consumers as well. And what's been really striking for me is the amount of stories that have hit the press over the last few months in terms of fraud and counterfeit. It's very evocative, it's very emotive, because a lot of those stories are about medical devices, pharmaceuticals, cures for COVID, testing kits for COVID, and everything that pretty much goes with that. I'm pleased that we're seeing more stories, because that gets the challenge more into the public eye. And I think consumer and also business education is key for how we solve the challenges that we see online from a brand protection perspective in the future. But it also worries me that there must be such a big problem going on out there for it to hit the press, that to see these multiple stories means that the criminals are taking advantage of these opportunities. So that's a bit of scene setting in terms of what's actually happening online. Where do we go in terms of what does this mean for businesses? We're talking to a lot of people at the moment. Obviously, we talk to our clients and prospects on a daily basis. But we're also talking to a lot of new people who are reaching out to us to understand a little bit more about what's going on and what that means for their businesses. So the general consensus is that most businesses were unprepared when COVID-19 was thrust upon us. And now the key questions that they're asking themselves is, what is our digital strategy? What can we do about that right now? What's the right thing to be doing right now? What assets do we have in place? Is the strategy working? Do we need to revisit that strategy? How do we decide if we need anything else to help us secure our distribution on digital channels? And to be honest, who can help us with that? What companies are out there that can give us an expert opinion on what we need to do next? So in the context of what I talked about, the 5 areas of what makes up online brand protection, I'm just going to touch on a few of these in a little bit more detail. But we're certainly seeing an uptick in the outreach of companies coming to us. And what I should say as well is that, your bigger companies of this world, some of the global brand leaders, if you like, have been involved in online brand protection for a very long time. Even they're scratching their heads a little bit with the decade or so experience that they might have of trying to fight this. What we're also seeing is a lot of smaller companies, a lot of SMEs, what we term medium-sized companies coming to us because they're beginning to get hit as well by these challenges, and they've never seen that before. So it's important to keep the lines of communication open, and certainly we're having a lot of very interesting discussions with people who are trying to understand what's going on and what they can do about it. The key starting point, I think, is do you have the right digital assets in place? And funnily enough, a lot of companies have traditionally seen their domain name portfolio as a cost center, as a bit of a management headache, as a bit of a drag. Looked at it a bit negatively, if you like. They're fairly complex things to manage. But more so now, we're looking at domains not being a cost center. Of course, they do cost, but they're also a revenue enabler and a key route to market. Your domains will drive your email, they will drive your corporate site, they'll drive your e-commerce site. And so they are absolutely fundamental as to how businesses do business through digital channels. So there's a lot of focus now on domain portfolios. There's a lot of focus on whether those portfolios accurately represent and protect the IP rights that have been registered maybe through the trademark space. A lot of emphasis on whether that portfolio is set up properly to help businesses achieve their goals by product, by service, or by geography, for example. And not only that, but we know that budgets are under pressure. A lot of domain managers or people who look after domain names have inherited portfolios, have, through acquisition or through, domains that were registered 10 years ago and are still being renewed on a kind of a slavish basis. We're also being asked to identify where people can cut costs in terms of their domain portfolios and strip out domains that that the business don't necessarily need. Now those can be divested either by letting them lapse, or some of them have some value on the open market. So again, that's a couple of things that we're being asked to look at. And very fundamentally, the question that we're asking is what was the last time? When was the last time that a domain audit was undertaken and your processes and protocols were reviewed? Again, there's a balance here between, do you have the right assets in place versus an opportunity to cut costs and revise, what you have. And I think that's an important way of looking at it. There's a lot of reporting going on at the moment about intellectual property being, more valuable, being, a key part of how businesses move forward. So having the right digital assets in place, I think, is extremely important and a fundamental step in terms of how you protect yourselves and do business online. One thing that is not necessarily looked at as often as maybe it should be is that once you've got those domains, are they secure? So obviously you want to do business with the right kind of registrar. Corporate registrars are set up to provide the right level of securities for corporate domain name portfolios. There's a lot of corporates out there with multiple retail registrars that they use to register and maintain their domains. That might be a deliberate policy and decision, in which case absolutely fantastic, no problem at all. But I would encourage people to look at and understand where their domains are being held and whether that's the right thing to do for their business. There are mechanisms such as locking and blocking for domains that will allow you to put higher levels of security in place for them. Again, those are things that should be looked at on a domain by domain basis. For example, your critical business domains should be locked at both registrar and registry level. This allows extra security to be put in place, preventing criminals hijacking or using your domains for fraudulent purposes. And again, any good registrar should be able to tell you about that and the merits of it. The protocols that do that, it's advisable to put those in place to make sure that when domains are registered or renewed, those security elements are checked. And one of the key things that people often neglect is, do you have the right kind of education processes in place to minimize human error? A lot of fraud occurs because of human error, and it's quite easy to put in place an information leaflet or an information campaign or policy and distribute that to your colleagues in order to make sure that they have less chance of falling foul to fraud, whether they control the domain names or not. On the right hand side of the slide, you can see a couple of kind of articles and thought leadership pieces that we have. Again, my colleague Stuart Fuller, who runs brand services, he puts a lot of very informative pieces out into the marketplace. So you can find those on our website, where you might find things of interest for specific things to do with security and blocking. So moving on to third-party use of IP rights, what I would say is the kind of the traditional brand protection piece. We've seen a lot of familiar battlegrounds accelerate during COVID-19. I don't think that any of these areas, three areas that I'm going to talk about, are groundbreakingly new, but they have certainly evolved in the last few months. So I really believe that they're worth revisiting to make sure that from a brand protection perspective, your brand at least knows what is going on and whether you need to take any steps to protect yourself. So I'm going to start by talking about domain name infringements. Having been involved in some very kind of, let's say, complex, multi-brand, multi-jurisdictional, global anti-counterfeiting and anti-fraud programs over the years, I think domain name infringements get overlooked as a key building block as part of a robust brand protection strategy. It's always been seen as the kind of the poor relation of maybe taking 30,000 listings off marketplace sites, for example. Domains are seen, as I said, as a fairly dull part of the internet. But I think we need to change that, and I think we need to refocus on domain name registrations and what they are being used for. That's why I'm putting some emphasis on it in terms of this presentation. On the left-hand side, you can see an example domain that is on the face of it, ip-infringement.com. It's actually lpinfringement.com. I'm not going to try and pronounce that. But it's just to illustrate how easy it is for people to swap letters and around and to use other letters within registrations to make things confusingly similar to brand names. So we're seeing a massive uptick in the amount of domain names that are registered that are infringing. Some of those are to do directly with COVID-19. So anything with COVID and testing in it and a brand name, anything to do with maybe a pharmaceutical product name and testing in it. We've seen, huge amounts of domains registered using that as a tactic. But this boils down to individual brand level as well. Because of the shift online of consumers and the distribution of products and services, and frankly, e-commerce sites online, the criminals know that, and they also know that a lot of people who aren't used to buying things through digital channels have begun to do that, and those people are perhaps easy prey for them. So no brand is safe from this. We are seeing brands across the board have an acceleration of infringements, and those infringements at domain level are used for phishing and fraud. They're used for the sale of counterfeit goods, and they're also used for revenue diversion and generation by third parties off the back of brand owners' IP rights. This is a fundamental part and a real kind of first case scenario for any brand protection program online. I believe it forms part of any brand protection program, and it should be the starting point, at least for consideration. There are some things that you can easily, put in place to help you with this. You can understand, what's going on online, and you can basically look at whether you have the right digital assets registered. You can use specialist tools to monitor registrations for your intellectual property, but importantly, look at typos and homographs as well. Homographs are where letters are replaced with similar letters from different alphabets. So you might have a Greek A replacing a Latin A, for example. And there are tools out there that can find those variations for you. You want a service that's going to get you results as soon as possible, so you can do something about the most important and impactful infringements, and you want to focus on key brands and geographies. And it's a good idea to put a policy in place that says, okay, if we find these kind of infringements, those are the ones that we want to go after first. So as a basic building block for a brand to look out onto the internet for IP infringements, I think domain monitoring and enforcement is a really important part of it. Secondly, and linked to domains, we're looking at an increase in fraud, and we're seeing anecdotally and through the press a lot of phishing and social engineering going on. That happens through domain names. It happens through social media channels where people are socially engineering or targeting specific members of staff in specific companies who perhaps are unfamiliar with the working practices that they have right now from a digital perspective. I anecdotally heard of a case where an executive assistant to the head of finance of a company was targeted by a fraudster who sent them a spoofed email using a confusingly similar domain to their corporate domain, asking them to transfer a certain amount of money to a new supplier. That was executed. The EA did that, and obviously the fraud was completed. And it wasn't for a while until they found out about that, when it actually appeared on some accounting invoices, and that they recognized that it was erroneous. But it's something that is on the rise. People are on LinkedIn, people are on other social media like Facebook, for example, and it's fairly straightforward for somebody to start talking to those people, understand a little bit more about them, build a bit of trust, and then commit that fraud. So looking on places like social media for fake profiles of executives is an important part of a program, as well as obviously tying that into domain name registrations. The consequence of this is losing revenue and reputation to fraud. Again, it's about understanding what you have in place for security for your existing digital assets. It's about doing simple things like locking critical domains, and helping, using a registrar that's going to help you with security, enforcing against infringements, and again, providing training to your colleagues to mitigate the risk, because a lot of this can be prevented through human education. The last area to look at in this particular instance is counterfeit. There's been a massive surge in counterfeit activity. The increase in trade, again, not just from business to consumer, but also business to business, is providing opportunity for people to manufacture and distribute counterfeit goods through digital channels. Obviously, consumers, some of them knowingly buy counterfeits on a regular basis. A lot more consumers now are unwittingly buying counterfeits. We don't have any up-to-date figures, but I believe when probably next year, when the 2020 dust settles and we see figures, we will see a lot of increase across the board. And we're also seeing companies that have never been counterfeited before seeing counterfeit goods starting to appear. That could be for new types of products such as sanitizer or PPE that are being distributed across online channels, or it could be for the more well-established routes in places like luxury and apparel, when new companies are doing business online and the counterfeiters are taking advantage of that. So from a counterfeiting perspective, if you have a counterfeit challenge, it's important to look at not just domain registrations, but also websites, marketplaces, and social media, amongst other places. If you are being counterfeited, I see counterfeiters as a key competitor to legitimate businesses. Depending upon which report you believe, anything up to 15% of certain industries is lost through counterfeit on an annual basis. So it is a big challenge. Revenues and reputation again get affected. My key advice, if you think you've got counterfeit challenges, really to understand the landscape and the scope of the challenges facing your brand. Ask for help. There are people who can help you to do that. We can help you do that, and we can certainly help you put a strategy together. It's up to you what you do about that counterfeit problem, but there are specialist solutions out there that help you to either have a very broad anti-counterfeiting program or some very specific focused, perhaps by geography or by product, programs that you can put in place, maybe to control costs. There are comprehensive brand protection providers who can do that for you, but again, my advice is to understand exactly what's being deployed so you can keep control of budgets and the outputs, so you can measure return on investment. In terms of enforcing your intellectual property rights when you found infringements, again, I think it's absolutely imperative to move quickly these days. Once you found those infringements, you'll see on the right-hand side a list of the different kind of enforcement capabilities available. That's some of them. But I think the most important thing is to work with an expert partner who can help you to choose the right enforcement action for each individual case, and who has the opportunity to use different enforcement capabilities to get the result that you need, which is something removed quickly and efficiently and cost effectively. So again, just bear in mind that perhaps some of the more traditional law firms will be expensive. Perhaps some of the new innovative law firms will offer better enforcement actions, and certainly brand protection specialists like us have key capabilities across the board. So you do have options. Some of them are really cost effective, and you can do something about those infringements once you found them. So there is recourse for you, and you can mitigate the risk. So in summary, we've covered a lot of ground. In summary, I would say that COVID-19 has caused a sharp increase in the distribution of goods through digital channels. More businesses are moving online, more consumers are moving online, and a lot more trade is being done in the online space. Criminals know this and exploit this. They follow the trends. They stay ahead sometimes of the brand owners, and they will be defrauding customers and selling a high level of counterfeit through some of the online channels. Brands that think they haven't been affected up to now, I'd really strongly advise them to at least take a look at this in more depth and understand if they are being affected now. I think brands that were on the counterfeiters' radar before are more likely now to have seen a rise in activity. So again, it might be time to reset policies and strategies and to take a look from an auditing perspective as to what's going on online. And also bear in mind that you're not alone. Knowledge and expert help is out there, and you can take effective measures to mitigate the risk. Yes, it will cost you some money, but I believe the mitigating effect will certainly increase revenues and opportunities in the long run. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been useful for you. I know we've covered a lot of ground. What I would say is that I'm open to any questions or comments, either now or afterwards. Here's my contact details. Please feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to have conversations with any of you. I'm going to hand you back to Andy right now and see if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Haydn, for such a thought-provoking and informative presentation. Unfortunately for you, Haydn, your work isn't quite done yet, because I'm very pleased to say that we've had a number of questions received. Some of them are kind of themed around the same kind of topic. So if we can answer several of them in one go, that would be quite helpful.
I'll give it a go.
Okay, so the first one we've had in said, when do brands normally consider brand protection strategies? Is it before they actually start trading online or after they see infringing activity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So unfortunately, a lot of the time, brand protection strategies are only considered after people have started noticing infringements or activity. That is brought to their attention normally either by customers or distributors or people who have a legitimate interest in their business. I would urge that, going back to the kind of 5 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle I had at the beginning of the presentation, I think when you're thinking about getting your IP rights registered and what you want to do as a business, what you want to achieve, I think if you can consider how brand protection fits into that and how your company is going to evolve in the future, it's much more cost effective to do it at the point of origin, so early in the cycle, than then trying to fix the challenge a little bit later on. So I think there's merit in considering brand protection strategy as part of those the registration of the IP rights and then the digital assets that go alongside that. If you're going to be trading in the online space, and if you are in an industry, let's say that is prone to counterfeit, of which most of them are now, then at least having the knowledge that it may happen to you and putting a plan in place, I think is good to get in early in the cycle of the brand development.
Thank you. And then another question we've had in is, with the increase in spend on digital transformation that you spoke about earlier, are you seeing a corresponding increase in the online brand protection spend of companies?
So I think there's two answers to that. I think we're seeing lots of people who have never done any brand protection online before interested in what they can do. So that would necessitate an increase in spend, if you like. People looking to defend their IP rights and defend their consumers and customers from a B2B perspective. So yes is the answer to that. I think the second answer to that is companies who are spending already significant amounts of money in online brand protection, maybe for, let's say, global anti-counterfeiting services, are considering how that money is spent and what they are getting out of those services in terms of impact. I think there's an evolution under the way as to how people look at online brand protection, and certainly everyone is considering what they're doing. So more people are starting to do it. So yeah, an upturn in spend where people haven't done it before. But the people who are spending money right now are not necessarily spending more, but they're thinking much harder about how to make that spend most effective.
Thanks, Haydn. And then there have been a theme, several questions along the same theme. One is about what sort of a budget should I allocate to online brand protection, which is a bit of a movable feast, I think. But another one, which is kind of along the same theme, says, my executives have a big budget focus right now due to COVID. So what are the key messages I need to pass on to the executives to help them understand the importance of this topic?
That's a great question, and like you said, it's a little bit of a kind of a movable feast. I think the honest answer is it depends on the brand, and it depends on the industry that you're in, and it depends upon the current activity online to do with your brand. So my advice to people is always to try and understand what is happening online and what risk that presents to your business. You can do that through using technology and through using brand protection experts. We do a lot of auditing for people so they can understand the scope and the size of the challenge. Once you've done that, you can make some estimations as to how that will be affecting your business. Now, you can either do that through that auditing process, the kind of activity that's going on, the kind of infringements that you're seeing, or you can use third-party reports to make some assumptions. Once I find that you understand a little bit more about the online environment and you start talking about potential losses or potential risk to businesses, it gets executives' attention fairly quickly, because everybody knows that online is an opportunity. Everybody knows that there are risks in doing business online. So it's a question of quantifying it, putting it in front of the right people, and I think that that will grab attention and make it easier as an internal sell to explore online brand protection in more detail. Again, we do that kind of work a lot for people, and they find it extremely useful in building that internal case.
Thank you. And then I'm conscious that time is kind of moving on now, but maybe we have time for one or two more questions. One of the questions that's come in is about the type of activity that we should look at, first of all, in terms of brand protection. So we've had two questions around the same sort of theme, but one is, if you only have a small budget that you can use for brand protection, what is the best use of that budget? And which activity would you recommend all businesses undertake? So
I'll answer the second one first, if that's okay. So I'm a big believer in domains being an enabler of business online. I think if you were going to look at one thing, it would have to be to do with what third parties are using your IP in their domain names. How are they registering them? How are they using them? And what are the consequences of that? You can do that at pretty low cost, and it gives you a really good idea as to what's going on, and it gives you the opportunity to kill that activity at source. Okay, so I think looking at that is a fundamental building block and a natural progression from your IP rights to your digital assets to protecting those in a very fundamental and straightforward way. So that's the answer to the second question. In terms of the first question, I'll go back to the knowledge base. It's really important. Every business is different, even if you're in the same industry as other people, right? So it's really important to understand, what are your business ambitions? Where do you want to do business? Have you got a certain product that you're going to push in a certain country in the near future that is critical to how your business is going to grow? If so, align your brand protection strategy with your business strategy. Make sure that you're protecting your best assets in the right way. So if you have a limited budget to spend and you have a limited kind of capability in terms of finding infringements and taking action against them. I'll give you an example. An extreme example: if you're a luxury goods company and you want to move into China and you see that as absolutely fundamental to your next stage of growth or thriving as a company, make sure you've got the right IP and you're protecting that IP in that particular territory. If you're a business that's just focused on Europe, then make sure the big European e-commerce sites, for example, you're looking at. Make sure you're looking at domains to do with European extensions. So it really depends upon what your business ambitions are and how they move forward as to where you focus your limited brand protection spend. And again, it's about being kind of clever and strategic. If 90% of your revenues come from one particular product, you might want to protect that product over the long tail of others that you have, right? So it's about cutting the cloth, to suit your individual needs, and you can only do that with getting the knowledge as to what's going on and aligning that to your business strategy.
Thanks, Haydn. And just a couple of quick questions to close with. In your experience, how many registrars actually suspend domain names without a legal court order?
Okay, that's a great question. And again, that's a bit of a movable feast. There are some registrars who are seen as safe harbors for online criminals, let's say. So it's very difficult to get a result in those. However, there is a kind of a global trend towards registrars and registries, for that matter, taking responsibility for what's happening within their infrastructure. Okay, so I can't give you an exact number because that moves on a daily basis. Some of the Russian and Chinese registrars, for example, sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. It depends on the time of year and the personnel who actually get the request. There are other things that you can do. Again, I alluded to maybe law enforcement or certainly disrupting the e-commerce side by suspending the content. Sometimes you just can't get a result. That's the true nature of online enforcement. But you've got to treat every single case on its own merit. And more often than not, there are ways to do it, which is why you've got to have an innovative and flexible approach, I think.
Okay, yeah, and then final question, I think, before we close the session, because we are overrunning a bit. There's been a kind of a growing movement for businesses to consider representing the value of their domain names as an intangible asset on their balance sheet. Have you seen much movement in that respect? Is this a more common thing than previously?
So I think that's a really interesting question. So, I think intellectual property, as I alluded to, is coming to the, more to the forefront of how you value a business. There are intangible elements to that, but what I would say is that if you have a domain name that costs $25 a year, but you're running $50 million worth of business through it on a monthly basis, that becomes an asset, not just from an IP perspective, but a pure business asset that needs to be noticed and needs to be recorded, if you like. Interestingly, what I have seen is a lot of work with mergers and acquisitions firms. Certainly, there's been an uptick in that, as unfortunately some companies don't make it through COVID and have assets, including IP assets, that are being sold on. So we're seeing a lot of focus on those digital assets and how they affect the valuation of those businesses, and we're seeing a lot of interest in people acquiring them. So you know, it's definitely an area that's getting more focus. Definitely as digital matures a little bit, people are looking at those assets and understanding what they can do with them. And certainly in terms of transferring those assets from one entity to another, again, we're seeing a lot of requests as to how we can help people to do that and keep an eye on it throughout that transfer process. So yeah, it's coming up more and more on the radar, definitely.
Right, thanks, Haydn. We'll consider your hard work done today, and we'll let you go and get a well-earned rest and a lie down in a darkened room. Just a couple of things before we finish. Please do join us for our next webinar, which is on the 8th of October at 3 p.m. British summertime, where Stuart Fuller, who's the head of brand services for the Central Knit Group, will be explaining about how SSL certificate industry is evolving to protect the interest of internet users. And then finally, we will be sending out a link with access to this presentation again, so you can review it. And if you want to get a copy of the presentation itself, please do just drop us a line at info@brandshelter.com, and we'll send out a copy to you. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance, and we hope to see you again on the 8th of October. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.